The morning the courthouse doors sighed open, the air had the taste of metal. Rain clung to the city like a tired coat, the streets shining in the half-light, and the triplets walked shoulder to shoulder past the security line as if they had rehearsed this moment forever. People turned. They always did. Not just because triplets draw eyes, but because these three, Ava with her chin lifted like a dare, Ben with his unblinking gaze that sliced problems into clean pieces, and Kara with the kind of gentle focus that makes even chaos sit up straighter, moved like a single decision. Their mother walked half a step behind them, fingers brushing the strap of a worn handbag, knuckles pale. Elena wore the navy dress she had saved for interviews, a pair of heels that pinched, and a locket she never took off. She had pinned her hair into a calm that wasn't real, and smiled like a person who knows exactly how much the smile can hide. The case number was printed in stark black on the docket outside courtroom 7. The words beneath it, State v. Elena Dyer, were the kind of words that put tremors in a life. The bailiff checked their names, and the metal detector sided with them, letting them through. Many things this morning would not. An assistant to the prosecutor drifted by with an armful of files and a smirk that said the state was ready. A local reporter raised a phone and whispered, "That's her," and the phone's small eye blinked hungry. Elena felt the floor pull at her feet. Ava squeezed her hand and whispered, "We stand, all three of us." Ben didn't say anything. He'd learned that silence can be a blade when it needs to be. Kara just nodded and slid a battered USB drive deeper into the pocket of her cardigan until it pressed her palm like a talisman. Inside, the courtroom was one of those spaces built to make people smaller. High ceilings, wood polished to a mirror, flags and seals, and a portrait of Justice herself wearing a blindfold and a solemn expression that never had to make rent. The prosecutor, a man named Horace Kell, arranged his papers with the theatrical efficiency of someone who never misplaced a single paperclip. And the defense attorney, they'd had to take a public defender because decent lawyers accept retainers and promises don't count, leaned toward Elena with a quiet, practiced voice. "We'll start with arraignment. You plead not guilty. I'll argue for release on recognizance. Keep your answers short." Elena nodded. It all felt like a room she had read about once, far away, where the language sounded familiar but behaved differently. She had been a bookkeeper at the Riverlight Relief Foundation for 5 years. The numbers had always told stories to her. Who was careful, who was careless, which project needed coaxing, which donor changed their mind and didn't want to admit it. When the accusation came, $250,000 missing over a year, tiny sums siphoned like sand from many buckets. The numbers turned on her, and the story they told became monstrous. At 9:02, the side door opened and the judge entered, black robe drawing a flat quiet across the room. People stood. Elena stood with her, instinct, respect or fear lifting her up. Ava's breath went short. Ben's knuckles whitened around the edge of the pew. Kara's eyes widened, not at the robe or the ceremony, but at the man wearing them. Julian Harrington was younger than most expected a judge to be, but that was what the news had been full of for months. Billionaire tech founder turned civic crusader, accepting a special appointment to the bench to clear a backlog of corruption and charity fraud cases. The city liked its ironies. The state liked his money and his machines, and he liked the idea of proof. He had a face made for press conferences and stillness, a sharpness that suggested mathematics, and the calm of someone who once measured time in shares and sprints, and now measured it in testimony and minutes. He took his seat with a careful, deliberate motion, and if his eyes paused when they reached Elena, it was only for a fraction of a second, like a hinge noticing an old door it had once swung for. He looked away. The clerk read the case name. The words landed in the air like pins. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the state alleges that the defendant, entrusted with the bookkeeping of a relief organization dedicated to housing assistance, manipulated ledger entries and redirected funds to accounts under her control, accounts that, notably, belonged to shell companies with no employees or operations." Elena felt the words pass over her head like a dark parade. Shell companies, manipulated, redirected. It was like being described by someone who had watched her through frosted glass and decided who she was by the blur. "Ms. Dyer," the defense attorney whispered, "eyes on me." His voice anchored her the way a steady dock takes a rope in storm water. We enter not guilty. We ask for time to review discovery. We request that the court permit testimony from your children are here? They're here, Elena said, and she hated how it wavered. The judge looked at counsel. Peel? Not guilty, the defense said. Very well. Bail? The prosecutor was already ready. Given the severity of the allegations, the amount allegedly misappropriated, and the clear risk of flight, Ben made a sound like a swallowed protest. Ava squeezed his hand, warning. Kara's eyes widened, not at the robe or the ceremony, but at the man wearing them. The public defender cleared his throat. Your Honor, Ms. Dyer is a lifelong resident. She has 3 children, minors, nearly adults. In school, she holds 2 part-time jobs since her termination and has no prior record, not even a parking ticket. The alleged shell accounts are a matter for trial. We ask for release on recognizance. The judge's eyes moved between them with the precise patience of a watchmaker. He looked at Elena, not through her, at her. Something flickered and extinguished before it could be read. He had the strange sensation of ground tilted a fraction of a degree, as if the room had been repainted in a color he once knew. His voice, when it arrived, held its public calm. Ms. Dyer, do you understand the charges? Yes, Your Honor. Do you have a passport? No. Any property outside the state? No. Children? Yes, she swallowed. 3. Names and ages? Ava, Ben, and Kara. 17. It struck her as unfair to have to say their names here as if the syllables themselves were evidence to be inventoried. The judge nodded and wrote something on the pad in front of him. On the second line of his note, where he might have written a phrase like stable address or employment status, his hand had written a different word without his consent, triplets. He put his pen down and let the silence do its work for an extra heartbeat. Release on recognizance. Surrender any firearms if you have them. I don't, Elena said. Then you may continue to not have them. He almost smiled. Almost. We will set a date for a preliminary hearing and timeline for discovery. Counsel, approach. They spoke at the bench in the hush bubble of white noise. The prosecutor outlined his plan to introduce bank records and expert testimony on money laundering. The public defender nodded finely, like a man listening to the rain describe how it means to soak him. The judge set dates, wrangled calendars, and then his eyes slid to the gallery where the triplets sat. What startled him wasn't resemblance. People saw ghosts and cheekbones all the time. It wasn't the line of their noses or the grit in the girl's stare or the boy's way of counting breaths. It was the proximity of a memory, the way a specific summer night in 2007 unfolded in his mind with the aggression of something he thought he'd archived. A cafe at the edge of the river, the lights smearing on the water like paint. A girl with weary laughter and a moral spine you could tune a piano to. She had been working 2 shifts, finishing a class in accounting, and he had been a man with a head full of code and a belief that money could fix everything if it behaved. He had been nobody then, just a kid with big hands and a mind that shook the edges of problems to see what fell out. They had talked until the river decided it was morning. He ignored the memory the way you ignore a notification that you can't deal with. He sent the courtroom back to its ritual. We'll break for 15, he said, and banged the gavel gently, a sound like a reasonable door closing. In the hallway, the reporter pounced. Miss Dyer, do you have a statement? No, Elena said. Did you steal the money? No, Ava said with a clarity that startled even her. She didn't. The reporter turned the phone to the girl, scenting a better angle, but it was the boy who stepped between them, quiet and complete, and the reporter, surprised, lowered the phone. We'll talk after the hearing, he tried, but the triplets had already shepherded their mother away. In the empty niche by the water fountain, they stood in a circle that was both huddle and oath. We can do this, Ava said, because someone had to say it out loud every hour or the world would forget. We have what we need. She looked to Ben. I went through 12 months of the Foundation's public filings, crossed the vendor payments with the state database of registered business entities. 2 of the vendors don't exist. The addresses are just mail drops leased by a company that also leases to 4 other shell corps that have connections to Caldwell's brother-in-law. Caldwell, Elena said softly, and there it was again, the betrayal like a bruise she kept bumping. Marcus Caldwell, executive director, straight teeth, generosity that belonged to the camera. He had hired her. He had told her he needed someone whose hands were clean. He had told her stories about the good that money does, while building a ladder to somewhere else with the planks of people's checks. I pulled the IP logs from the vendor portal. Login activity shows that the request approvals came from an IP not registered to the foundation, but to a co-working space across town. The approvals happened past midnight. Mom was asleep those days. I have our home internet logs to show that. And he patted his pocket, looked embarrassed. I know it's stupid, but I wrote a little script that monitors the co-working space router's DHCP lease table. I started it after Mom was suspended. If we can subpoena their logs, I can correlate. Ava grinned for the first time that morning. You're ridiculous, you know that. I know, Ben said, both insulted and flattered. Kara reached into her pocket and took out the USB, rubbing the metal with her thumb. And the voicemail, she said. The word felt like glass in her mouth. The voicemail had come on a Thursday night, a voice they knew too well, one of those wrong number situations that are actually the truth forgetting its disguise. In it, Caldwell's voice said, "Listen, Marta, I need those transfers to hit before Friday. Split them. If it looks like Elena signed them, the system won't flag it. We'll clean up the markers later." There had been a clink of ice, the low hum of a bar, laughter that didn't belong to a person who ever filled out forms. Elena had stared at her phone for an hour after it came. She had deleted it twice in panic and twice restored it in terror. Then she had given the phone to Kara because Kara believed in small machines that held memory like nets. "I don't want you to testify," Elena said. It came out too fast, a reflex. "It's not your job to fix this. It's mine." Ava set her jaw in that way that meant the decision had already happened. "We are your job, Mom. That's what you always say. We are your job and your joy and your headache, so let us do ours." "Your job is school," Elena tried. "School is waiting," Ben said, not unkind. "A system will be here when this is over. It won't be here if you're not." Kara didn't speak. She just reached for Elena's hand and pressed. And in that press was every night of homework at the kitchen table, every scraped knee whispered over, every rent check made of hope and coupons and the extra shift. Elena's breath shook, and she nodded, once. Back in the courtroom, the 15 minutes stretched to 20 because calendars always lie. The judge stayed in chambers looking at the notes he'd made and the edges of the past trying to sneak under the door. On the corner of his desk was a small box of the sort that holds paper clips or ghosts. He opened it without thinking and found the Polaroid he kept there as if it were merely a reminder to be human. A photo from another lifetime, 2 kids on a riverfront bench, their faces half lit by the smear of city light. The mouth of the girl laughing at something he couldn't remember. The boy beside her looking the way you look when the future is a dare. The back had 2 words in a neat hand. Be brave. The girl had written it. He had carried that phrase into boardrooms, into code reviews, into the kind of wealth that amplifies the volume on your character. He closed the box. It was absurd. The mind makes parallels where it wants comfort. The woman in my courtroom could simply be another human with a locket and a spine. The triplets could be nothing like him. The thought that rose next was a wild animal, and he should have caged it. What if they are? He returned to the bench with the face the public had come to trust. The bailiff called the room to order. The prosecutor stood with the coiled satisfaction of a man about to arrange his dominoes. "Your Honor, the state calls Investigator Rowe." A woman with sharp eyes and a ponytail took the stand, sworn in. She unfolded a narrative the way people with badges learn to do. Bank accounts, timestamps, transfers, checks signed by an E. Dyer according to the stylus logs of the approval app. A visual path that turned the air into arrows and boxes. The jury was months away, but the gallery shifted as if a verdict were a weather front. The defense attorney objected to the conclusions. The judge sustained or overruled with a measured hand. None of it mattered yet, and all of it mattered always. When the state finished its preamble and requested the court take judicial notice of the bank records, the defense stood. "Before we stipulate," he said with a glance at Elena that was half apology, "the defense would ask leave to call 3 witnesses this morning to address Foundation procedure and to provide evidence bearing on alternative perpetrators." The prosecutor's eyebrows climbed with affected surprise. "Alternative perpetrators?" "Protocols exist so people can't do what you allege Elena did," the defender said. "If those protocols failed, it's relevant. If they were overridden, it's more relevant. The witnesses are close to Elena's home life and can testify to her schedule and to receiving communications from the executive director. They are also—" He hesitated as if he was about to bring circus animals into a Senate hearing. "Her children." The prosecutor smiled the way a cat considers a birdcage. Your Honor, the state is not opposed to relevant testimony, but this courtroom is not an audition for a family drama. If counsel wants to parade teenagers, they're 17, the defender said, and their testimony pertains to facts, not character. The judge looked at Elena, then at the three in the pew who had straightened, as if a private command snapped off inside them. His gaze dropped, almost unintentionally, to the locket at her collarbone. A simple brass oval. He felt a memory of cool metal against his palm. The rational part of his brain set a guard around the irrational one. I will allow it, he said, if the testimony sticks to facts. Ava stood first. She walked to the stand like a girl who had decided to stop being a girl some time ago. The oath sounded like a vow she would have made anyway. State your name, the defense said. Ava Dyer. Relation to the defendant. She's my mom. Do you know the operating hours of the Riverlight Relief Foundation when your mother worked there? Weekdays 9 to 5. Sometimes she worked late to close the month. We made dinner when she did. Were you ever present at the foundation offices? Yes, I did my homework there some days after school when Mom couldn't get back in time. Mr. Caldwell said it was fine. Did you observe the sign-off procedure for vendor payments? Yes, 2 approvals, sometimes 3 on larger disbursements. Mom's approval came after vendor intake, and then Mr. Caldwell approved, and then larger things went to the board. Did you ever observe your mother signing approvals late at night? No, and she said it in a way that turned the word into architecture. At night, she was home. She was always home. The prosecutor stood. Cross, the judge said, and the prosecutor made a sympathetic face that had never been true. Ava, you love your mother. Yes. Would you lie for her? No. People say that, right, before they lie. You said you were present after school. Did you have keycard access? No. So your knowledge of the approval processes is that of a teenager observing from a chair in a hallway. Ava's jaw set. From a desk in the back office where I filed purchase orders because the intern quit, and I read the manual because I was bored. You read the manual, he repeated as if suggesting she had read a fairy tale. Twice. Someone in the back snorted. The judge cut the air with a word. Sustained as to tone, counsel, ask a question. The prosecutor smiled, wrongly. No further questions. Ben went next. He was less good with faces and more with facts. The oath was an equation with outputs he respected. He adjusted the mic 2 millimeters so it sat square. Name? Benjamin Dyer. You prefer Ben? Yes. The defender nodded. Do you have any experience with networks or data analysis? Ben blinked twice, decided humility had its place but not here, and said yes. In what way? I built a community internet mesh during the pandemic using salvaged routers, then moved on to penetration testing for a volunteer mutual aid group to harden their donor portal. I've done coursework online. I'm good with logs. The prosecutor made a small, contemptuous sound that only he thought sounded like a cough. The judge's eyes moved to Ben's hands. One finger tapped a rhythm, 5-7-5, that matched the way Julian used to think through problems, the haiku counts of logic. It was nothing. It was everything. What did you find related to this case? The defender asked.
Ben outlined it cleanly. No jargon he couldn't explain. He showed the co-working space leases he'd found through public records, the overlapping LLC names, the IP ranges assigned to that building, the vendor portal timestamps, the distance between their home and the office, the sleep data from a fitness watch that Elena wore on nights the approvals moved. He spoke like a person who doesn't try to sound smart and therefore usually does. He ended with, I can provide the code I used. It just scrapes public access points, nothing intrusive. On cross, the prosecutor asked whether Ben had ever been inside the co-working space. No. Whether he could prove whose fingers tapped the approvals. No. Whether he thought it was wise to present himself as a hacker in a courtroom. Ben opened his mouth to say what he thought about wisdom and rooms, and then closed it, choosing the discipline he had learned from a mother who had made dinner stretch. Kara saved herself for last, because that was her way. She collected what people dropped and handed it back to them in a shape they could use. She took the oath and thought about how the word truth tastes like coins. Name? Kara Dyer. The defender's voice softened without intending to. Kara, do you have something you wish to provide to the court? Yes. She took out the USB and held it out like a small confession. The bailiff took it to the clerk, who slid it into the evidence laptop with the care of a person feeding a dragon. The audio filled the room a moment later. The tinny distance of a voicemail, the scrape of glass, Caldwell's voice varnished with drink and entitlement. "Listen, Marta, I need those transfers to hit before Friday. Split them. If it looks like Alana signed them, the system won't flag it. We'll clean up the markers later." There was a hush, a different kind. The prosecutor stood immediately. "Objection, hearsay, foundation." "We can subpoena the phone carrier records. The number matches Mr. Caldwell's known line. Voice authentication, we'll schedule a hearing on admissibility," the judge said, cutting a clean channel through the tangle. His voice had shifted a fraction lower. He looked at Kara, the way she sat very still, and stared at the pixels as if the pixels could tell her what she had done. He could see in her the person who held things together while others performed breaking. "Kara," the defender said gently, "do you know who Marta is?" Kara Dyer. "Her name is Marta Lyle. She's Caldwell's assistant. She lives 2 blocks from us. She told me once in the grocery store that Mom was lucky to work for a man like him. She said one day he'd fix our lives. She said it like a threat." "Objection to the commentary," the prosecutor said quickly, but the words didn't sound like they usually did. His tone had thinned. "Sustained. Jury will disregard," the judge said, out of habit, and then remembered there was no jury, only a city listening. "Strike the commentary." He doodled a box in the margin of his notes and filled it in completely, black square swallowing white paper. He didn't trust his voice when he asked the next question. "Ms. Dyer, do you know the date this voicemail was received?" "June 4th, 8:13 p.m. The judge's pen paused. June 4th was a date that meant nothing except everything because it slid into the pocket inside his chest where he kept time with the precision of a watchmaker. He opened the small box again in his mind and looked at the Polaroid. On the back, the date, September 12th, 2007. He clamped down on the drift. He was a judge. He was a man who believed in compartments. And yet, the morning stretched its legs into noon, and time did what it always does in courtrooms. It collected people like a net collects fish, then forgot to let them go. The defense rested for the day, having made their points and not wanting to spend capital they didn't have. The prosecutor asked for the voicemail to be excluded, and the judge told him to file his motion before close of business. The clerk set the dates no one could keep. The bailiff called all rise, and everyone did, because you do, even when you're tired of rising. As the room emptied, the triplets stayed put, as if the gravity in their row had tripled. Ilana touched each of their shoulders with the lightness of a person trying not to leave fingerprints. She said, "Thank you," and there was too much in it. Pride, fear, a gratitude that wanted to break out of her in weeping and couldn't. Ava exhaled. "We did it," she said, which wasn't true yet, but truth sometimes needs to be coaxed. Ben nodded and stared at the sealed USB envelope as if he could will it to remain uncorrupted, unlost, unchallenged. He had already drafted 3 backup paths in his head. Kara looked up at the bench. The judge had disappeared into his door, the one the public doesn't use, the one that leads to rooms where people remove their faces and sit with their thoughts. She wondered what his thoughts looked like. She wondered why he had looked at their mother like that for the length of a heartbeat between sentences. Inside chambers, the man the news called the billionaire judge sat in a chair that probably had been sat in by men who never worried about rent and men who worried about everything. He took off his robe and draped it over a hook, and under it he looked like a person who keeps secrets in boxes and opens them when the room is empty. He took out the Polaroid. He let the past play back, because if he didn't, it would simply find new ways to project itself onto the walls. Her name had been Elena then, too. She had told him the locket was cheap metal, but held a photograph of her mother, the only picture she had. He had told him that code was just a way of telling a story you could run, and she had smilingly called him a poet and told him to eat his fries before they went sad. They had walked along the flood wall and pointed at apartments they would never live in. They had kissed once, breathless and baffled and young. The next day he had flown to a pitch that would change his life, and when he came back, she was gone. Moved apartments, changed shifts, number disconnected. He had looked for 3 weeks. Then his life had accelerated, and the past became a misfiled invoice that no one had the time to find. And now, here she was, a woman in a navy dress with a locket and a spine, standing under his jurisdiction and fighting to keep a life she had built from unraveling. And here were three 17-year-olds whose faces were their own and also not. Genetics is a drunk painter. It finds patterns where you want them. But then he remembered the way the boy tapped the 575, the girl's neat ferocity, the third's kindness that moved like a glue you couldn't detect until the structure held. He opened a drawer and took out a thin folder, labeled with his own messy handwriting, Conflict Protocol. When he agreed to sit the bench for a year, he had written the protocol for himself because no one else had ever been him. It contained one rule. If the case contains a personal connection that could compromise impartiality, disclose and recuse. He stared at the one rule. He pressed his thumb to the page as if it might give back a pulse. But the connection, right now, was a memory, and a coincidence, and a ghost. He could disclose a ghost. He could recuse from a memory. He could also destroy a case that needed someone competent to referee it by giving it to a judge with a backlog 6 months deep. He closed the folder. He had until the next hearing to decide whether the past constituted a conflict or a phantom. He also had another job, a better one, that didn't make the news, to make sure the truth didn't get trampled by wealth. He would not tolerate theater from the prosecution. He would not permit speeches from the defense. He would not, under any circumstance, allow the existence of 3 teenagers with matching birthdays to alter the trajectory of evidence. He put the robe back on. He walked to the door. He almost opened it. He didn't. He turned back and looked once more at the Polaroid, at the words on the back, "Be brave." He put it away because bravery now meant something else. By the time the triplets shepherded their mother to the exit, the rain had deepened into a steady percussion. The steps were slick. People were watching and pretending not to. Caldwell was nowhere. He always made entrances, not exits. Elena breathed in wet air and felt as if her lungs had never been used properly before. She said home, because the body needs a place to associate with safety, even when safety is a technicality. On the sidewalk, a woman with clipped hair and a steel umbrella detached from the wall like a shadow learning autonomy. "Ms. Dyer," she said, accents scraping at the edges of the syllables like someone who'd done her homework. "Marta Lyle." The 3 triplets turned as one. The umbrella lowered enough to show a face that was less cruel than tired, less sure than performance. "I shouldn't talk to you, but I don't know how to do math on sleeping." She looked at the triplets, and something like shame crossed the space between her eyebrows. "He thinks he can make this go away. He thinks money is rain, but rain only makes some things grow." "Will you testify?" Ava asked, already stepping forward, already weaponizing hope. Marta's mouth twisted against the rain. She said, "I will not perjure myself," which is one way of saying, "I'm afraid. But if a subpoena arrives with my name on it, I will not break my phone or lose my memory. Do you understand?" Ben nodded. "We understand." He already had her address. He had had it for weeks. He had decided not to use it because there are lines you don't cross even if the people on the other side have a ladder. Now he wouldn't have to. Marta hesitated, then reached into her coat and handed Elena a folded napkin, the kind you get with a drink when the bartender knows your name. There were numbers on it. The shell company that matters, the one that isn't a shell. He keeps what he cares about close. "Why?" Kara asked quietly. Marta blinked against the rain. Because once, 15 years ago, he loved something he couldn't keep, and now he keeps everything else. She looked at Elena, really looked, and then turned away like a person who narrowly avoided.
In the quiet apartment with the crooked window frame and the plant that refused to die, they ate pasta that tasted like relief. The news did its work on the television with the volume off. A headline asked a question no headline has ever wanted answered. Did bookkeeper betray homeless families? The picture showed Elena's face in a way that made it look like a stranger you'd cross the street to avoid. Ava picked up the remote and turned the screen to black. "Mom," Ben said, and the way he said it made Elena look up as if summoned. "Whatever happens, we go all the way." "All the way," Kara echoed, and her voice carried it like a melody. Ava didn't repeat the phrase. She went to the drawer where the bills lived and took out the letter that had started all this, the notice of termination, the accusation, the polite firmness of the phrasing that made theft sound like scheduling. She unfolded it and smoothed the creases. Then she took a pen and wrote across the bottom in clean, capital letters, "We stand." She taped it to the refrigerator with a strip of blue painter's tape that had been saved from a failed attempt to fix a window gap. It looked absurd there, next to a grocery list and a hand-drawn calendar and a magnet with a beach they had never seen. It also looked like something you could lean your back against. Far away in a different part of the city, a man whose name had been in too many magazines poured himself a glass of water and stood in the dark with a robe draped over a chair. He thought about ethics and about evidence, and about the shape of three faces sitting in a front pew. He thought about a voice on a voicemail saying what money always says if no one makes it behave. He thought about a locket, a cheap brass oval that could only be purchased from a stall near the river in the summer of 2007, a stall that had been torn down when the city decided to grow sleeker. He did something no one would write about. He picked up a pen and wrote a note to his clerk. "In the morning, please request sealed HR records from Riverlight, including access logs for executive accounts and any internal audits conducted in the last 18 months. Also, please schedule a chambers conference with counsel, potential conflict disclosure." He underlined the last phrase once. He did not know what he would say yet. He would find out when the room was quiet and his mouth formed the words. At midnight, rain stopped pretending and came down properly, flattening the city's edges. The triplets slept like people who had been holding themselves up by tension and suddenly released it. Elena lay awake with her eyes open to the dim light from the street and the sound of water traveling through pipes like secret messengers. She slipped a thumb under the locket and pressed it to her skin so the metal took her temperature. In the quiet, the past walked through her small room, sat on the chair, and asked its question. She didn't answer it. Not yet. In the morning, she would stand in a room with a man who might once have been a boy at a river bench, and she would tell the truth in the way truth sometimes has to be told, not as a confession, but as a path through a forest where someone has hidden a trap. The city turned the page that night. It did not know it had. But in a courthouse where wood gleamed and a portrait wore a blindfold, a judge dreamed of a Polaroid with 2 words on the back, and 3 teenagers dreamed of a machine that would take what was broken and run it through until the code compiled. Somewhere, a man named Marcus Caldwell checked his phone, saw an email he didn't like, and told himself that money was rain. And if you listened closely, down the hall and through the thin walls and into the quiet kitchen with the taped letter on the fridge, you could hear the smallest of sounds, like a decision being made. The click of a USB stick settling against wood, as if getting comfortable for a long, necessary fight. The city was never silent, but on the morning of the preliminary hearing, it sounded like it was trying to whisper something nobody could quite catch. The courthouse clock struck 9, and the triplets moved through the revolving doors with their mother between them, tighter than before, as though the days since the arraignment had braided them into something new. Elena's face had the tired glow of someone who had not slept in full nights but had instead stitched together fragments of rest between pacing and praying. Her children were armor and fire both, carrying USBs, notes, and a sense of defiance that didn't fit their age but suited their cause. The judge arrived through his private entrance, robe heavy but conscience heavier. He had spent 2 days pretending to review other cases while every line of Elena's face followed him like a watermark. He had read the conflict protocol a dozen times and still hadn't signed the disclosure. He knew the law. Perception matters as much as truth. But if perception was his compass, he was already lost, because every time he looked at those triplets, he saw himself refracted into different angles he had never lived. The boy's habits, the girl's jaw, the kindness in the third. It was as though someone had taken his own features and painted them with Elena's patience. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself stories, the way powerful men do when they want to believe they're in control. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters came earlier now, hungry for a scandal that tasted like betrayal and redemption. Activists from the Riverlight projects showed up, some wearing t-shirts that read, "Housing is Hope." A cluster of foundation board members occupied the back row, whispering in low, clipped tones. Caldwell himself hadn't appeared yet, but his name sat in the air like smoke before fire. The clerk called the case. State v. Ilana Dyer. The room shifted its attention like a single animal turning its head. "Ready for the state," the prosecutor said, crisp. "Ready for the defense," the public defender replied, his voice measured, but with the fatigue of a man who carried too many files and not enough victories. The judge adjusted his pen, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his notes. "Proceed." The prosecutor began with theater, as men like him always do. "Your Honor, what we have here is not merely theft, but betrayal. Funds meant for shelter, for families in desperate need, siphoned away. The evidence is clear. Records, signatures, transfers. This is not a case of mistakes. This is a case of deliberate deceit." Ilana's stomach nodded. Every word he said was a blade slicing the skin of her reputation. She had learned long ago that character takes a lifetime to build, but only a sentence to ruin. She gripped the edge of the table, fingers trembling. Ava touched her arm, steadying her, as though to remind her that truth has its own spine. The defense rose. "Your Honor, the state's picture is incomplete. We intend to show evidence that another individual had motive, means, and opportunity. We ask permission to call our first witness today, Miss Marta Lyle, assistant to the executive director of Riverlight." The judge's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. Marta. The name had appeared on that voicemail. He remembered the triplets telling him about her in careful fragments. He nodded. "Call your witness." Marta entered the courtroom slowly, her steel umbrella absent, her eyes ringed with fatigue. She looked like a woman who had been carrying someone else's secrets too long and had finally realized secrets grow heavier the longer you hold them. She swore the oath with a voice that cracked, then sat down and folded her hands as though bracing for an earthquake. "Miss Lyle," the defense began, "how long have you worked at the Riverlight Relief Foundation?" 8 years, she said, voice quiet but clear. "Who is your direct supervisor?" "Marcus Caldwell." "Can you describe his involvement in the financial operations of the foundation?" Marta hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the back row, where 2 board members sat, arms crossed. He oversaw approvals. He had final authority on vendor payments above a certain threshold." "Did you ever hear him speak about manipulating those approvals?" Another pause. A swallow. "Yes." "Could you elaborate?" Marta shifted in her seat. He would instruct me to forward requests to him directly, bypassing the standard queue. He sometimes said things like, "We'll clean this later," or "It doesn't matter whose signature the system shows as long as the timing works." I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough. The prosecutor was on his feet. "Objection, hearsay and speculation." "Sustained as to speculation," the judge said, though his hand trembled slightly before he set down the pen. "Witness may testify only to statements she directly heard." Marta nodded. "I heard him say that if it looked like Ilana signed, the system wouldn't flag it." He laughed when he said it. He thought it was clever. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ilana's heart slammed against her ribs. The triplets sat straighter, eyes fixed on Marta as though pulling each word out of her. The defense pressed forward. "Miss Lyle, did you ever hear Mr. Caldwell mention transfers to Marta?" She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Yes. He would call me. From bars, from meetings, late at night. He'd say, 'Marta, push the transfers. Marta, split the payments. Marta, make it clean.' He used my name because he trusted me not to repeat it. I was loyal. Until now," the defense said softly. "Until now. Because loyalty shouldn't mean burying the truth." The prosecutor launched into cross-examination with teeth bared. Miss Lyle, do you have any documentation of these alleged instructions? No. Any emails, texts, recordings? No. He called. He didn't write. So we are to take your word for it. Marta's eyes hardened. You can take the word of the voicemail, too, the one where he says my name and hers. The prosecutor froze for a split second, then forced a smile. We'll let the court determine admissibility. He pivoted quickly. Miss Lyle, isn't it true that you were passed over for promotion last year? That you were unhappy with your salary? Yes. And that you bore resentment towards Mr. Caldwell? Marta's lips twisted. Resentment doesn't make voices on voicemails. Resentment doesn't sign shell company leases. Resentment doesn't move money at midnight. The gallery stirred again. The judge lifted a hand and restored silence. Inside, though, his thoughts roared. He had always believed numbers don't lie, but here were numbers twisted and forged, wrapped in voices that did. And here was a woman breaking loyalty, not for gain, but for something that looked like penance. The defense rested Marta, and the state scrambled to minimize the damage. The judge called a recess, his gavel sounding like thunder. In chambers, he sat with his head in his hands. His clerk entered with a stack of sealed HR records, just as he had requested days earlier. He flipped through them quickly, each page a needle to his conscience. Caldwell's login credentials had overridden standard approvals 27 times in the last year. Access logs placed him inside the system at hours Elena was verifiably home. The internal audit flagged discrepancies that were never reported to the board. All of it pointed away from Elena. All of it pointed directly at Caldwell. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt the old ghost tighten its grip, because alongside the logs was an employee intake form from 2007, Elena's first hire at the foundation, a temporary bookkeeping position, emergency contact listed, Julian Harrington. His name. His own name in her handwriting. He dropped the file as if it had burned him. The knock on the door startled him. Your Honor, the clerk said, we're ready to resume. He gathered himself. He put on the mask judges wear, the one that says impartiality even when storms rage underneath. But as he walked back into the courtroom, his gaze slid again, more to the triplets. Their faces turned toward him with the raw courage of young soldiers who don't yet know the cost of war. He wanted to tell himself again that resemblance was coincidence, but then Ben tapped his pen on the table. 575, and the sound echoed like a memory too precise to deny. The hearing resumed. The prosecutor tried to reframe the evidence, insisting the digital logs could be manipulated, that Marta was bitter, that the voicemail could be misheard. The defense countered with clarity, laying out timelines, sleep logs, vendor shells. The triplets sat as silent sentinels, their presence itself a statement. We believe her. The judge recessed for the day, with motions pending. As the room emptied, Caldwell finally appeared, tall and polished, his smile rehearsed, shaking hands with board members. His eyes met Elena's for the first time, and the smile flickered into something colder. He leaned close as he passed her table, voice low. You should have taken the fall. It would have been easier for everyone. Ava shot to her feet, but Ben pulled her down, eyes blazing. Kara whispered, not here, though her tans trembled. Elena sat frozen, the words digging into her like claws. She had once trusted that man. Now he stood above her, daring her to fight. The judge watched the exchange, every muscle tight. He knew then that
The third day of hearings began under a gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the courthouse dome like an iron weight. Crowds had gathered outside, their signs demanding justice, some for Elena, some against her, some simply there to witness a scandal with teeth. The triplets moved like a single current around their mother, guiding her through the gauntlet of cameras, their own nerves hidden beneath layers of resolve. Inside, the courtroom pulsed with tension. Every seat was filled. Reporters had arrived before dawn to claim their places. The prosecutor sat stiff, lips tight,
his case weakened but not collapsed. Caldwell was there too, immaculately dressed, his cologne faint but sharp, a presence as cold as marble. He smiled occasionally, the kind of smile meant to mask fear with arrogance. The judge entered, robe flowing, but beneath the fabric his heart carried a war. He had spent the night revisiting a memory he had long tried to bury. An evening years ago when Elena had sat across from him in a small cafe, laughter soft, eyes tired from work but alive with something deeper. They had parted with promises, but his career had swept him elsewhere, into a life where ambition shouted louder than affection. Now, seeing her in chains of accusation and the triplets by her side, the promises he abandoned echoed like a verdict unspoken. The clerk called the case, and the prosecutor rose first. His words were sharp, but less certain than before. Your Honor, the defense has presented testimony that is, at best, unreliable. Miss Lyle's statements lack corroboration. The so-called voicemail is inadmissible without proper authentication. We urge the court to focus on what is indisputable. The defendant's digital signature appears on multiple fraudulent transfers. The defense stood calmly. And we have shown those signatures could be applied without her action through Mr. Caldwell's override credentials. We intend to prove that not only could this fraud have been committed by someone else, but that it was. Caldwell smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. Your Honor, the defense continued, we call Benjamin Dyer. A hush spread. Ben stood, shoulders squared, eyes clear. He carried no folder, only a notebook tucked under his arm. As he swore the oath, Elena's chest swelled with both fear and pride. The defense began. Ben, you're one of Elena's triplets, correct? Yes. And you've been reviewing records related to this case? Yes, for months. Tell the court what you found. Ben opened his notebook. The Foundation's transaction logs are time-stamped. My mom was home with us during many of the flagged times. I compared the system's login IP addresses to the network at our apartment. They don't match. The logins came from the Foundation's main office, sometimes at 2 in the morning. We were all asleep together. She couldn't have been there. The prosecutor objected. He is not a certified forensic analyst. This is speculation. The judge leaned forward. Overruled. This is cross-examination material. Let him continue. His voice carried more weight than usual, because inside he knew the boy was telling truth not just with data, but with conviction. Ben continued, flipping to another page. I also found a pattern. Every fraudulent transfer happened within 48 hours of large donations. It's like someone was skimming the top before it settled. The transfers went to shell accounts under names like Silvermark and Deltara Holdings. I traced them. They all connect back to leases in Marcus Caldwell's name. The gallery gasped. Caldwell's face remained a mask, but his jaw tightened. The defense said, no further questions. The prosecutor approached. Ben, you're a bright young man, but isn't it true you're not trained in finance or cybersecurity? I learned what I had to, Ben replied simply. And you'd do anything to protect your mother, wouldn't you? Yes, Ben said, his voice steady, including telling the truth. The prosecutor faltered. He moved to sit, but Caldwell leaned toward him, whispering something urgent. Reluctantly, the prosecutor arose again. Your Honor, the state calls Marcus Caldwell. The courtroom froze. Elena's breath caught. The triplets exchanged a glance like sparks off flint. The judge's hand hovered over his gavel, then lowered. Very well, Mr. Caldwell, take the stand. Caldwell walked with confidence, as though the very air parted for him. He swore the oath with a faint smirk, then sat down, legs crossed, a picture of control. The prosecutor began. Mr. Caldwell, as Executive Director of Riverlight Relief Foundation, what was your role in financial oversight? I approved disbursements, ensured compliance, and secured donations. I ran the foundation like a ship, efficient. Did you ever direct funds improperly?
No. Did you ever instruct Miss Lyle or anyone else to falsify records? Absolutely not. And these transfers trace to your name. Coincidence. I own multiple companies. I can't be responsible for every coincidence that bears my name. The prosecutor nodded, then stepped back. No further questions. The defense rose slowly. Mr. Caldwell, you claim coincidence. But is it also coincidence that your login credentials appear on overrides tied to the fraudulent transfers? I had assistants. Many had my access for convenience. And is it coincidence that phone records show calls to Marta Lyle minutes before flagged transactions? Caldwell's smirk flickered. I make many calls. The defense's voice sharpened. Is it coincidence that funds ended in accounts linked to your properties, that you mocked the system's vulnerabilities in front of your staff, that you pressured Elena to sign blank forms? Caldwell leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Objection, the prosecutor snapped, but Caldwell silenced him with a raised hand. Let him talk. Answer the question, the defense pressed. Caldwell's calm cracked. Maybe I pushed the limits. Maybe I bent things. But I built that foundation. I made it powerful. And if a little money shifted to keep the wheels greased, so what? That woman, he jabbed a finger at Elena, was supposed to be grateful. She came from nothing. I gave her everything. And she dares accuse me. Gasps filled the room. The judge slammed the gavel. Order! But Caldwell wasn't finished. His voice rose, dripping venom. She knew what she was signing. She knew the game. And if she didn't, then she was too blind to matter. Ava shot up from the bench. "Shh, that's a lie," she shouted, her voice cracking with fury. Kara pulled her down, tears burning her eyes. Ben clenched his fists, knuckles white. The judge's heart pounded. Caldwell's arrogance was undeniable proof, but more than that, it was the contempt in his tone, the dismissal of Elena's worth. It burned through the judge's chest like fire. "Mr. Caldwell," the defense said softly, almost gently, "one last question. Why did you want Elena to take the fall?" Caldwell sneered. "Because she was disposable. Nobody would believe her over me. Not then, not now." The silence after those words was electric. The judge's gavel stuck, echoing like thunder. "That will be enough." His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with restrained fury. "This court has heard enough to proceed to trial, but I will say this now. Integrity is not disposable. Human dignity is not disposable. This hearing is adjourned until final motions." The room erupted, reporters scrambling, activists shouting, cameras flashing. Caldwell stormed out, face tight with rage. Elena sat frozen, tears sliding silently. The triplets wrapped around her, 3 branches shielding the same root. When the gallery emptied, the judge remained. He dismissed the clerk, then looked across at Elena and her children. His robe suddenly felt unbearably heavy. "Elena," he said quietly, breaking every protocol. She looked up, startled. "I need to speak with you, privately." In chambers, the air was thick with words unspoken. The triplets stood close, protective, ready. Elena's eyes were weary. The judge removed his glasses, set them on the desk. His voice was low, raw. "There is something I must tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Elena stiffened. "Julian." Her voice was a whisper, trembling between memory and recognition. The triplets exchanged startled glances. The judge, Julian Harrington, nodded. "Yes, I left. I chose ambition. I thought I could return one day when life was simpler. But life never simplifies itself, does it?" His gaze shifted to the 3 young faces. His throat tightened. "They're mine, aren't they?" A silence deeper than any gavel strike filled the room. Elena's eyes brimmed with tears. She nodded. Once.
Ava gasped. Ben's jaw fell slack. Kara pressed her hand to her chest as though holding her heart in place. Julian's voice cracked. I see myself in them. I tried to deny it,